The frame rides on the spring. When a wheel moves up over a bump or down into a hole, the frame moves with it. Not as hard or as far, but it moves.
Most people think American cars in the 50s and 60s were all about horsepower, big block V8s, cubic inches, and drag strip bragging rights. But what if I told you Detroit almost changed everything? Not with more power, but with how those cars actually handled. There was a hidden revolution happening underneath the sheet metal. Radical suspension designs that could have rewritten the rulebook. Some made it to production, most didn't. And today, we're uncovering the forgotten engineering that almost changed American cars forever. By the mid-1950s, Detroit had a problem, and everybody knew it. American cars were getting bigger, heavier, and faster. But underneath, they were riding on suspension technology that hadn't fundamentally changed since the 1930s. Solid axles front and rear, leaf springs, maybe some coil springs if you were lucky. The result was a car that wallowed like a boat, leaned in corners like the Titanic, and bounced down the highway with all the grace of a stagecoach. Engineers knew the limitations. When one wheel hit a bump on a solid axle, it affected both wheels. The heavy axle assembly, complete with differential, drive shafts, and that massive steel tube holding it all together, created enormous unsprung weight. That weight couldn't be controlled by the springs, so every pothole, every bump, every imperfection in the road got transferred straight through to the chassis and into your spine. And then there was body roll. American cars of this era were famous for it. Soft springs made for a comfortable highway cruise, sure, but take a corner with any enthusiasm and the whole car would lean over like it was about to tip. The physics were simple. The suspension was tuned for comfort, not control. Anti-roll bars were an afterthought if they existed at all. By the late 50s, as interstate highways opened up and speeds increased, these problems became impossible to ignore. European imports like Mercedes-Benz and Jaguar were showing American buyers what independent suspension could do. Better ride, better handling, less drama. Detroit's response? They knew they had to innovate, or at least try. In 1958, Detroit made its move. Cadillac led the charge with what they called air suspension, a four-corner system that replaced traditional coil springs with air-filled bladders. The promise was revolutionary: automatic load leveling, a smoother ride, and a car that could adjust its height on the fly. It cost $215, about $2,300 in today's money, and it was marketed as the future. Chevrolet, Buick, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, Ford, and Mercury all followed suit that same year with their own versions. On paper, it was brilliant. The system used rubber air springs instead of metal coils. An onboard compressor would pump air into the bladders to maintain ride height no matter the load. Sensors would detect when the car sagged and automatically adjust. It was self-leveling luxury. But in practice, it was a disaster. The air chambers leaked, the copper air lines cracked, the pneumatic control valves, delicate little things, proved utterly unreliable. The compressor had to process massive volumes of air, and with that came moisture. In cold climates, the whole system would freeze solid. Ford reportedly stopped selling their Ford Air suspension in regions where temperatures dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit because the control valves would lock up. Chevrolet and Oldsmobile dropped the system after just 1 year. Pontiac and Buick hung on for 2. Cadillac, ever stubborn, kept offering it through 1960 before finally admitting defeat. For Buick, the unpopular air poise suspension contributed to the division's sales collapse in 1958, dropping them to 5th place in the industry. The technology wasn't wrong, it was just decades ahead of the materials and manufacturing processes needed to make it work. Today, air suspension is everywhere: luxury cars, trucks, buses. But in 1958, It was a spectacular, expensive failure. While GM and Ford were fumbling with air suspension, Chrysler took a different approach. In 1957, they went all in on torsion bars. Torsion bars weren't new. Volkswagen Beetles had been using them for years, and European manufacturers loved them. But Chrysler was the first American automaker to roll them out across every car in their lineup. Plymouth, Dodge, DeSoto, Chrysler, Imperial, every single one got torsion air suspension for 1957. Here's how it worked. Instead of a coil spring, you had a long steel bar mounted lengthwise under the car. One end was anchored to the frame, the other end connected to the lower control arm. When the wheel hit a bump, the bar would twist, and that twisting action provided the spring force. The advantages were real. Torsion bars were lighter than coil springs, about a third less weight according to Chrysler's engineers. They took up less vertical space, which meant you could lower the hood without sacrificing suspension travel. And crucially, ride height was adjustable with a simple bolt. No need to swap springs on the assembly line for different option packages. But the real win was in handling. Chrysler combined the torsion bars with a redesigned front suspension that featured upper control arms angled at 17 degrees to provide anti-dive geometry under braking. The result? The 1957 Chryslers were the best handling American cars you could buy. Period. Automotive journalist Tom McCahill, a guy who loved Chryslers, famously put together a torture test in 1958 where he drove sedans from GM, Ford, and Chrysler over brutal terrain. The GM and Ford cars with their coil and air suspensions? Catastrophic failures. Shock mounts ripped off. Trunks flew open. The Chrysler with its torsion bars sailed right through. Chrysler's tagline was, "Suddenly, it's 1960." And in terms of ride and handling, they weren't lying. It would take GM and Ford years to catch up. Of course, there were problems. Early torsion bars would sometimes snap without warning. The cars rusted spectacularly. Quality control was a nightmare. But the suspension itself, that worked. And Chrysler stuck with it, in various forms, all the way through 1989. In 1963, Chevrolet did something radical with the Corvette. They gave it independent rear suspension. This was a massive deal. Zora Arkus Duntov, the Belgian-born engineer who basically made the Corvette into a real sports car, had been pushing for IRS for years. He'd seen what European cars could do with it, Jaguar, Mercedes, Porsche, and he knew the Corvette's solid rear axle was holding it back. The problem with a live axle was brutal. When you mounted the differential, drive shafts, and axle housing all as one unit between the wheels, you created enormous unsprung weight. On the old C1 Corvette, that rear axle assembly weighed 301 pounds, all of it unsprung. The result? A choppy ride and handling that got sketchy at speed. Duntov's solution was a 3-link independent rear suspension. The differential was now bolted to the frame, not hanging off the axle. Each wheel could move independently. Unsprung weight dropped to 200 pounds, a 33% reduction. Handling transformed, the ride smoothed out. Automotive journalist Roger Huntington called it as advanced as the latest dual-purpose sports luxury cars from Europe. And here's the thing, GM had the technology. They'd already developed most of it for Project Q, a radical program in the late 50s that was supposed to give all of GM's sedans independent rear suspension, a rear-mounted transaxle, and 4-wheel disc brakes. It would have made GM's family cars the most sophisticated in the world. But Project Q never happened. Too expensive, too complex. The bean counters killed it. So the Corvette got IRS, and almost nothing else did. It would be 29 years until the 1992 Dodge Viper before another American manufacturer put independent rear suspension in a production car. Why? Cost. always cost. IRS required more parts, more assembly complexity, more development. For a sports car selling 20,000 units a year, you could justify it. For a Chevrolet Impala selling 800,000, absolutely not. The average buyer wouldn't even notice the difference, GM figured, so they stuck with what was cheap and simple. The irony is painful. For all GM's engineering prowess, for all the money they spent, the technology of their mainstream cars stood still. The Corvette only got IRS because Duntov was stubborn enough to fight for it, and because he knew which corporate buttons to push. Here's where it gets really technical, and where most American manufacturers gave up. Anti-dive and anti-squat geometry. These terms sound complex because they are, but the concept is simple. When you brake hard, your car's nose dives. When you floor it, the rear squats. Both movements upset the suspension's ability to do its job. They waste suspension travel, mess with your aero balance if you're racing, and generally make the car feel less composed. The solution? Design your suspension linkage geometry so that braking and acceleration forces counteract that pitching motion. Angle your upper control arms. Position your pivot points strategically. Create something called an instant center that works against the physics trying to tip your car forward or back. Chrysler's 1957 torsion air suspension had it. The upper control arms were angled at 17 degrees specifically to provide anti-dive geometry under braking. It worked. The car stayed flatter, more planted, more predictable. The 1963 Corvette had it too. Duntov designed anti-squat into the rear suspension to keep the car from rearing up under hard acceleration. So why didn't everyone do it? Because it's a compromise. Too much anti-dive or anti-squat, say 100%, and your suspension effectively locks up. It gets harsh. The ride turns into a jackhammer. Feedback through the steering becomes terrible. For passenger cars, engineers found that anything over 20 to 30% anti-dive made the car feel awful on the street. And American buyers? They didn't want harsh. They wanted soft, comfortable boulevard cruisers. Cars that floated down the highway. Anti-geometry was racing technology, performance technology. And Detroit couldn't sell performance to the masses in the 60s, not when buyers were prioritizing comfort, style, and chrome. So it stayed niche. The Corvette got it, some high-performance Chryslers got a version of it, and that was about it. The average Impala, Galaxy, or Fury? Nope. Just soft springs, lots of body roll, and dive for days. The technology was there. The engineers knew what worked. They'd proven it on test tracks and in prototypes. But between what's possible in engineering and what actually makes it to production, there's a canyon called economics. American cars in the 50s and 60s almost got sophisticated suspension systems that could have changed everything. Independent rear suspension, self-leveling air ride, load-sensitive geometry, handling that could compete with Europe's best. But almost doesn't change history. What we got instead was the muscle car era. Big engines bolted to crude chassis, drag strip heroes that couldn't handle a corner to save their lives. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s, when Japanese and German cars forced Detroit's hand, that American manufacturers finally started caring about what happened underneath the sheet metal. The forgotten suspension designs of the 60s? They weren't wrong, they were just ahead of their time, and way too expensive for the people signing the checks. If you found this deep dive into automotive engineering interesting, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.